So guys, it's been 7 or 8 years since I've done this, but there's no better time to do it, than right here at Easter, and I was glad that we were able to do it here on this Wednesday before, instead of doing it a couple of weeks back. But I want to take us. We're going to talk about what crucifixion is and everything, and then we're going to take Jesus all the way from the garden through everything that he endured up into his death on the cross. So there's going to be a lot of scripture. If you can't write, if you can't see to make notes and everything tonight, this will be recorded. Sherry's going to put it on YouTube, and we'll put the attachment on our Facebook page, on the church page, so that everybody can see it. Crucifixion. One of the most horrible ways to die in history. And it was perfected. These guys knew exactly what they were doing. It was invented by the Persian Empire. And it was then brought back to Egypt and Carthage by Alexander the Great. But it was perfected by the Romans, who learned it from the Carthaginians. It was chosen for 3 reasons. It was painful. It was lingering. There was nothing quick about a crucifixion. And it was a deterrent from other people to do the same crime. Almost like, back when we used to have like hangings on the court square, weren't as many crimes being committed in those days as there are now. But like I said, I want to start where the suffering started, and that was in the garden. The Garden of Gethsemane, everybody knows that's where Jesus went to pray a lot. That's where he went to pray here right before he was taken. Gethsemane comes from the Hebrew word gat shaman, which means oil press. This was extremely fitting considering the weight of the world that was being placed on Christ. So much so that an angel was sent from heaven to minister him. Luke chapter 22, starting in verse 41, says, "And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast, and kneeled down and prayed, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And there appeared an angel unto him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. And his sweat was as it were great drops of blood falling down on the ground." Guys, this is the only place in the entire Bible where this word agony is used. It comes from the Greek agonia, and it was used to signify pain of battle or conflict. So what was the conflict? This was not a conflict with God, because he said, "Not my will, but thine be done." It was not a conflict with Satan, because he'd already shown the ability to defeat him with God's word. This was a conflict with himself. His human nature versus his divinity. Guys, I told you, Jesus was 100% man, and he was 100% God. And at this point, this was his weakest moment. And it says that God sent an angel to strengthen him because of what he was having to endure. This is when he truly felt the cup for the first time. He said, if there's any way that this cup can be passed from me, what is the cup? It's all the sin. Everything that would ever be committed. It's where he felt it for the first time. Jesus literally had the sin of every human in existence poured out on him. Every child molester that reveled in the pain that they caused. Every murderer that killed in cold blood. Every drug addict that struggled with the next fix. He felt everything. And thus came verse 44, when he started sweating blood. You can go ahead. Let's give it a second. The medical term is hematidrosis. As a result of hemorrhage into the sweat glands, the skin became fragile and tender. Luke's description here in, chapter 22 supports the diagnosis of hematidrosis. Remember, Luke was a doctor. At the time of this writing, Luke would have known exactly what he was talking about. And of course, this is first century medicine. But still, this support, we see this now. Hematidrosis is a medical term caused in times of extreme stress when a person's blood pressure can go so high around the 300 systolic mark. So anybody that knows anything about blood pressure, you have a top number and a bottom number. Systolic, diastolic. Systolic, we love to see 120 or less. When you start getting 200, we start talking stroke range. 300 is as high as any monitor will go. So it could have been even higher. But when it gets up to that level, 300 mark or better, there are capillaries in the sweat glands that rupture because of so much pressure. So the blood is mixed with sweat. Nobody loses a great deal of blood through this. We're talking about capillary blood. We're not talking about big vessels or anything like that. So nobody's losing a lot of blood, but it results in extreme fatigue and also makes the skin very tender. And that's going to come into play a little later. Because if you've ever dealt with high blood pressure, if you've ever gone, been in an extremely stressful situation and it's finally over, you just feel like you can pass out. Everything feels like it's just weighing down on you. And so with him in this situation, this stress and blood pressure issue and all that is not going to go away. This is just going to continue. After he was taken, which was around midnight, he was brought before the high priest. This was when the first physical assaults started. The Bible says he was blindfolded and struck and spit on. John chapter 18 verse 22 says, "And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so?" I told you guys it makes the skin very tender when you're dealing with this hematidrosis. Think about it like if you've ever had a bad sunburn or something, and it's almost to the point of blistering, and then somebody touches it. It says it made a point to say that he struck him with an open palm. He slapped him across the face. Think about how tender his skin would have already been. There are other places in the Bible that says that they struck him, they pulled his beard out. This would have, been extremely, extremely painful. Much worse since his skin was already so tender. Next came Jesus' time with Pilate. He was shuffled around quite a bit between Pilate and Herod. Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23, starting at verse 1. Says, "And the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, Thou sayest it. Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, I find no fault in this man. And they were more fierce, saying, He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many of the things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned with him in many words, but Jesus answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod with his men of war set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. So, he's been up all day. They come and collect him, and take him about midnight. Now this beating starts. He's shuffled back and forth throughout the night. This in itself was against the law, Jewish law. He was not supposed to have been seen at night. They weren't supposed to have any kind of judgment or anything at night. Pilate finally made the decision to scourge him, hoping that this would appease the people and that they would let that be his final judgment. John chapter 19, verse 1 says, Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. Scourging was legal in every Roman execution except in the case of women, Roman senators, and Roman soldiers, unless they were convicted of desertion. The reason it was used was to weaken the victim through blood loss and shock, because a strong, healthy man could survive for days on a cross. Jewish law restricted the beatings to 39 lashes. You can go ahead and put the slide. This was accomplished by a 3-thonged leather flagrum. It's a short whip. This is not leather, but I made this a few years ago just to show this is the exact size and everything that it would have been. It was 3 thongs. So it would have been, these would have been leather straps instead of rope like I have. There would have been bone, pieces of iron, lead balls, anything that they could find. But it would have been about this size because it would have been easily wieldable by the centurions, by the Roman soldiers. And so 13 lashes would have been placed across the back and 13 across each shoulder. That would have counted the 39. But the Romans had no such restrictions, and the beatings were only mitigated by whoever was administering the scourging. So I know this slide is a little hard to see, but most people, when they think of a beating, they think of someone taking the whip, and sorry, I'm left-handed, so we've got to do it this way. They think of someone taking the whip and coming over the top or coming around this way. And I'm doing this kind of soft because I don't want any of my rocks or bone or anything to fly out of here. But that's not the way it would have been done. The way it would have been done in this time, and you can see from the top view here, the way that they would have done it, Jesus would have been strapped. I'll do it over here so I don't accidentally hurt him. Like Jesus would have been strapped here with his back out. The Roman soldier would have stood here, and he would have come this way, so that when he hit him, the bone, the iron pieces, all of that would have stuck. And so when he ripped back, he would have ripped the flesh and everything. He would have opened everything up. And that's what you can see here in this picture. He would take it in, and he would come across the side. You can go on to the next slide. So as he starts doing it, this is just out of an anatomy book, but I want to show you, what I'm talking about. All these muscles, the way these muscles come in. You've got the latissimus dorsi, the lats. Anybody that does any, weightlifting or anything, these lats. These muscles come all the way around. You would have also hit the biceps and the trapezius up here in your neck and shoulder, because like I said, they would do the shoulders and then across the back and the chest. So all of this would have been pulled loose. This longissimus muscle would have gone, from top to bottom. And so as you start pulling this across and ripping and tearing these muscles, the actual spine itself would have started to sag. I'm going to lose my place on my notes and stuff. So the initial strikes would have split the skin. First, we're talking 39 lashes. The initial stripes, stripes would have split the skin. But then these lead balls, these pieces of bone and everything would start causing blood-filled bruises or blood-filled contusions. And as they continued, those would tear loose. As the beating progressed, it would cut into the superficial back muscles, the trapezius and the latissimus dorsi that we talked about. The whip would wrap around and tear and cut into the pectoral muscles of the chest. Because you got to think he's completely exposed with his arms over his head. So as he's whipping around, this would whip around and catch into the pecs and, into the side, into the rib area, and start pulling and tearing all of this. As the lashes continued, it would flay into the deeper rector spinous muscles, the spinalis, the iliocostalis, and the longissimus, innervating by the dorsal rami from the spinal cord. As these nerves ruptured, the pain would have been constant. If you've ever cut yourself deep, the pain doesn't just go away when you close it up, because it's there on the inside. It's that nerve pain that really starts hurting. By the time they finished, 39 lashes, 13, 13, 13, with 3 strips apiece, tearing and pulling all of this, it would have looked like shredded meat. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24 says, who by his own self bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, being dead to sin, should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes ye are healed. We've all heard that verse before. But guys, in the original Greek, that word for stripes is molopai. And that's the singular number, strike. His back would have been such a bleeding mass of bruised tissue, it would have appeared as one single wound. It would have just been completely open. Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 29, mentions the next injury. Matthew 27:29 says, "And when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they spit on him and took the reed and smote him on the head." Now, guys, when we think of a crown of thorns, this is what we always see. It's what we always, whenever you think of it, you see it pictured like this. Whenever you go to any kind of passion play or anything, guys, these Roman soldiers, they didn't care who Jesus was. They would not have taken the time to make this look all pretty and to wrap it so neatly. Go to the next slide. This is what it would have looked like. They would have taken this and just mangled it all together and tied a rope around it and shoved it down on his head. The crown of thorns was probably made from the lote tree or the loti tree, whichever way you want to pronounce it. It was local to the region. The thorns averaged 1 inch in length. The soldiers would have never taken the time, like I said, to plait the wreath that's in most pictures. It would have been a mass of thorns like a helmet, like is seen here. It would have been beaten down onto and into his scalp. If you've ever cut yourself shaving, you know how easy it is to make your face bleed, to make your head bleed. The face and the head are extremely vascular. So if you're taking 1-inch spikes, 1-inch thorns, and beating them down onto the head and face, you're going to start going into and through all of these very, if you've ever seen a big cut or anything, the skull's like right there. You don't have to go far. You get a cut right here, and everybody always says, I can see his skull. It's pretty easy to see the skull because there's not a lot covering it. So if you were talking 1-inch thorns being slammed down and beaten in, it would have gone into and through every tissue right up to the bone and possibly even into the bone if those thorns were turned the right way. Go to the next slide. When you start talking about this is just just an anatomy drawing. But I want you to think about if you've ever done like pressure points or anything like that. Think about where you're pressing in here. This is the temporal area. You're pressing back here. You go right in behind the ear. Those things are very, very painful. So when you start going into that and you start pushing and pressuring through those things, you're actually going into nerves. You're actually tearing through those nerves. The thorns would have penetrated the frontalis and the occipital muscles. So this is the frontalis. This is right here around his eyes and everything. Possibly even going down through his eyebrow and his eyelids. We don't know. And then the temporal area would have been here over the ear. And then the occipital area would have been in the back. So all over his head. And again, it would have just been a bleeding mess. So you've got the back that's torn to shreds. He's losing blood there. Now you've got the head, extremely vascular. Lots of blood loss. And so you're losing blood here. And again, the pain would have been excruciating. This is not anything that would have stopped. This would have continued through his death. Those nerves would have been exposed. Any air, if you've ever gotten a toothache or anything, any air blows on it, it just makes it worse. Any air on exposed nerves makes it just that much more excruciating. By this time now, we're looking at pain and blood loss that would have had Jesus in the early stages of hypovolemic and hemorrhagic shock. His kidneys would have started shutting down. And his extremities would be getting very cold because his body would have been shunting all the blood it could back to his vital organs. So I don't know what the temperature is over in Jerusalem and everything. I don't know when this took place. But guys, he would have been freezing. Even if it was sunny and 70 degrees, he would have been freezing because all of the blood would have been shunted back to his core to try to keep him alive. His body would have been trying to keep him alive. When the Jewish leaders forced Pilate's hand and told him to release Barabbas and crucify Christ, then started the process of the crucifixion itself. Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15, verse 6. It says, "Now at the feast he released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them that had made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had ever done unto them." They desired Pilate to release him. "But Pilate answered them, saying, Will ye that I release unto you the King of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him from envy. But the chief priests moved the people, that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. And Pilate answering and said unto them, What will ye then that I shall do unto him who ye call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, Crucify him. Then Pilate said unto them, Why? What evil has this man done? And they cried out again the more exceedingly, Crucify him." Guys, now we're getting into the mob mentality. They don't see Jesus as a person anymore. He's been paraded in front of them. Now he's been beaten and scourged. Pilate did this hoping that that would appease them, that that would be enough. They would see him beaten and bloodied, and they would say, okay, that's good enough. He really hasn't done anything. You can let him go. But now the mob has just gotten incensed. And they're like, no, crucify him. Give us that murderer. Give us Barabbas. And guys, if you've never seen the Jonah Smith video on YouTube, just go home and type in Jonah Smith Barabbas. And just watch that video. It's just a few minutes. But it's so powerful that Jesus allowed Barabbas to be let go. He never spoke a word because he knew what he had to do. Now the crucifixion starts. Next slide. Most of the time, this is what we think of. It's what we've got on the wall. This is what we think of when we see Jesus on the cross. This is not the cross he would have been crucified on. He would have been crucified on a tau cross. An uppercase T instead of a lowercase t. The popular form used during Jesus' time was the tau, or the uppercase T. The stipes, or the upright part, which goes across the top, was, the stipes, or the upright part. This is upright. That's the stipes. Would have been secured in the ground. The crossbar, or the patabulum, would have weighed approximately 100 pounds. This is what Jesus would have had to carry from the Praetorum to Golgotha. The Praetorum to Golgotha is approximately 650 yards. 6.5 football fields. For anybody that needs, or a little over, 3/10 of a mile. He would have had to have walked with that. And it says, of course, we know that he couldn't carry it. It would have either been tied to him at this point, or perhaps he would have just been allowed to carry it on his shoulder. But as Scripture tells us, he was unable to bear the load, so the centurions pulled Simon out of the crowd to carry his cross. Side note, I want to read the Scripture real quick, where Simon is brought in. Mark chapter 15, verse 21. Says, "And they compelled one Simon, a Cyrenian, who passed by, coming out of the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross." Why is it important? I tell you guys all the time, the Bible ties everything together. Why is it important that we know who his kids are? Because if you look over in Romans chapter 16, verse 13, Paul says, "Salute Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine." This is the same Rufus that's mentioned here with Simon the Cyrenian. There are some who say that Rufus could have actually been Paul's stepbrother. But he says here that his mother was like a mother to him. It doesn't say that it was his mother. But I just think it's so cool how the Bible ties everything together. We didn't have to know that Simon had a son named Rufus, except that by telling us that Simon had a son named Rufus, we can see that same Rufus in the story with Paul. Who's to say that Simon, being brought into this, seeing Jesus, that this did not lead to his own salvation, and therefore the salvation of his children? And Rufus becomes a Christian, and then is honored by Paul in the letter to the Romans for all the work he did for Christ. Guys, it's stuff like that that just, it just blows my mind. And I know that has nothing to do with crucifixion, but I wanted to share that. I just thought it was really cool. Simon brings the cross with him. They're led by a standard bearer with a titulus. A titulus is a sign on a staff. You may have seen it in movies in the past, just a wooden post or a flag. And there's this guy carrying this flag bearing. And a lot of times that sign would have been posted above the crucified to show what crimes they had committed. That is why a lot of people think that this cross is represented, because it would have been the sign above him that would have been shown and shown what crimes he committed. But it wouldn't have been the Latin cross. It would have been the genuine cross here, the tau, with the tau across it. It would have made it look more like the Latin cross, though, if you put the titulus above it. Once at Calvary, Jesus' hands would have been nailed into the patibulum, into the bar across here. So he would have been nailed here. This is the size. Put it in the light so everybody can see it. This is the actual size. There have been some that have been excavated from the area. There's some Roman, of course the Romans were very meticulous in their writings and stuff, and they told everybody how to do this the right way. So this is the size that it would have been. It would have been between 5 and 7 inches long, 3/8 of an inch wide. I cut this out years ago, and I've kept it just to see it. He would have been pierced through the space between the lunate and the scaphoid bones. Go ahead. All right, so if you got your wrist here, you got your scaphoid bone and your lunate bone right above the radius and the ulna, the two bones that go up your arm. This is your radius and your ulna, the scaphoid and the lunate. So he would have been pierced here in between all 4 of these bones, in that center section right there. So if you want to see it in real life, right there is where it would have been. So many times, of course, in old pictures and things like that, you see him pierced right through the palm. That would not have worked. His body weight would not have been supported, and it would have just torn straight through. But you put it here. And like I said, guys, the Romans were, they were masters at this. They knew exactly what they were doing. You put it here in the center of all 4 of those bones, and it supports all of the weight you need it to without tearing through anything, because those bones all, that longness, that length of it there doesn't allow it to tear through because you have all those other things. He would have been pierced through there. As the spike presses through the space between the lunate and the scaphoid bones, it would have stabbed the medial nerve, or the median nerve, causing a condition known as causalgia, which is a local searing pain that would have radiated up all the way up through his arm. Just take your finger and press in right there as hard as you want to. You don't have to press very hard to start feeling some real pain. That's another one of those pressure points. Again, the Romans knew what they were doing. They knew how to cause the most pain with the least amount of effort. So if you take that spike and you stab it all the way through, that tears that nerve. And that nerve is now completely, again, exposed, and the pain will not stop. It will continue all the way up his arm, like just shooting every time his heart beats, basically. He will feel that. So it stabs through there. Go to the next slide. This slide is a little more hard to see, but I just want to be able to show you. Of course, this is the spike itself, 5 to 7 inches, like I said, 3/8 of an inch wide. So as it comes through, this is a cross section. They would have known that they did not want to touch the radial artery or the ulnar artery, because they don't want him to bleed out. They know if they put it right through this center section, they miss all the arteries. He's not going to bleed to death, but it's going to cause all of this excruciating pain. So they nail it all the way through with the palm up, all the way through into the cross itself, into the patibulum. And so this is this cross section here, just again so everybody can see where we're talking about. But they knew exactly where to go to cause the most pain with the least damage, so that he would not die from bleeding out before they could ever even get him put up on the cross. After he gets hoisted up onto the notch in the stipes. So the stipes sits up high, straight. They would have raised him up by ropes. After they nailed him here, they would have raised him up by ropes over that stipes and set him down into a notch on the top of it. That towel across the top would have set down in a notch so that it could have been easily taken up and down anytime they needed to. And so they set him in that towel, and once they get him up there, then his feet are nailed. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. His feet are nailed. There are two different ways that this is done. Either of them is correct. We don't know exactly which way was done for Jesus, but this was done, by the Romans. It was done one of two ways, and they were used interchangeably depending on who was putting him on a cross. So one, the spike could have been placed here through the cuneiform bone right below the metatarsal. So that would have been the way you see it a lot of times, just in most pictures, with his feet on top of one another and one spike going through both right through here. But the other way it could have been done is right down here through the calcaneus or the heel bone and the cuboid bone, right in between there. Sometimes they would have taken their feet and done them like this and put the spike sideways through here, through the cuboid, right below the cuboid bone, through the heel. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but I've got to think that's the most painful. I've got to think that's so much worse. Go to the next slide. So here, this is the way you usually see it. One foot on top of the other with one spike right through there. That's the first one that I was talking about. That's through just below the metatarsals and straight through with one on top of the other. But the other way, like I said, would have been, it would have gone straight through there. Right in, just above the heel, right at the cuboid bone, with the feet turned sideways. One on top of the other like that. I don't know what would have made the choice. Like I said, it may have just been who was putting them on the cross, who felt like doing what. But there were two different ways. Like I said, it was either the joint, the tarsometatarsal joint, or the transverse tarsal joint, which again is the calcaneus and the cuboid. After about 10 to 15 minutes of being hoisted up. So I want you guys to remember, Jesus was on that cross for hours. 10 to 15 minutes in, we start like this. We have a spike through each wrist and the spike through our feet. Whichever way you want to think about the spike being through the feet. 10 to 15 minutes in, every joint in his arms would have started to dislocate, just due to the weight of his body hanging there. If you've ever thought about hanging on a bar, a lot of times you'll see these things at the carnivals and stuff. Can you hang like this in a pull-up position for 1 minute? And most people can't do it for a minute. And that's a completely healthy, normal person. Their arms and their hands start weakening and they have to let go. Here in this position, you can't let go and there's nothing really to hold on to. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So you start to stretch, to weigh down, because everything is starting to pull loose. Your shoulders are disjointed, your elbows are disjointed, your wrists are disjointed. His arms would have been 9 inches longer than they were before he was hung, because of everything pulling down. The pain of the crucifixion and the ultimate death of every crucifixion was caused due to breathing issues. He would have been hanging in a Y shape. He would have been hanging like this. And to take a breath, he would have had to have pulled himself up into a T shape. So I want you to think about, and the reason why I use this slide is because it shows the chest muscles. If you've ever tried to take a deep breath from this position, it's very hard because you're already expanded. Your rib cage, you don't breathe from the inside out. You breathe from the outside in. When you take a breath, you don't know it. You don't physically have to think about it. But when you take a breath, your rib cage expands, allowing your lungs to fill. And when you exhale, your rib cage contracts. If you're hanging like this, your rib cage is completely expanded all the time. So the only way to take another breath is to pull yourself up to get just a little bit of compression on your rib cage so that you can take a breath in. And then you sag back down. And this goes on for time after time after time. He would have been hanging in the Y shape due to the pain and weakness, and his ribs were in a constant state of expansion. To take a breath, he would raise himself into a T position by pushing up with his pierced feet or pulling by his pierced wrists. Each time he moved, guys, you got to remember, this isn't a steel cross. This isn't a slick surface. This is a wooden cross, probably rough, splintered wood. We've already talked about what a mass of wound his back is. So every time he has to pull, every time he has to push, whatever he has to do, his back is rubbing against that wood, tearing and pulling even more, causing so much more pain. This would have gone on, Y to T, Y to T, until he became completely exhausted. He would begin to suffer from asphyxia, being unable to breathe. Death on the cross was caused by suffocation more times than not. He would have gone into respiratory acidosis because, again, all of these things going on, the loss of blood, this work of breathing. That's why when you see someone and they worked so hard, they're breathing so hard, if you've ever been in any situation in the hospital with a loved one or whatever, and you got somebody who is struggling to breathe and they're just breathing so hard and so fast, and suddenly they just quit. Because the body tells them you just can't go on. And so 9 times out of 10, that is what caused the death on the cross, was suffocation. But as these contusions, which he took from the beating, continued, the bleeding would have continued to seep into his chest cavity. You have to think about all the beating that he took, how once the back is exposed, the ribs are exposed, the only thing left there is the lungs. His lungs themselves would have taken beatings. There would have been blood-filled cavities in his lungs. And so now that we're getting to this point where he's nearing complete exhaustion, those cavities in his lungs and everything would have continued to fill with blood. So he would not have been breathing normally anymore. He would have been breathing like he was underwater. You've heard people, when they have too much fluid on their lungs, how it sounds really phlegmy and just horrible to listen to. And it sounds like they're drowning. Well, Jesus would have been drowning in his own blood with every breath that he took. And so as these contusions and bleeding continue to seep into the chest cavity, he would have developed pleural and cardiac effusions. This leads to cardiac tamponade. Cardiac tamponade is a compression of the heart itself. The heart has a sac around it, a protective sac, called and so as this continues to fill with blood, it doesn't allow the heart to pump. The more the sac fills, the less it allows the heart to expand and contract, the lub-dub. And this sac continues to fill with blood to the point that it's not getting anything done. It's just quivering. It's a quivering mass. This was the compression of the heart itself as the sac around the heart continued to fill and would not allow the heart to beat properly. John chapter 19, verse 30. It says, when Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Guys, the finality of Jesus' final statement and then his death leads most to believe that he suffered cardiac rupture. Literally, he died of a broken heart. his heart would have been so compressed by all the fluid around it that it literally, the sac would have ruptured and his heart stopped. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. The centurion comes up to make sure he's dead. You can come out and go back into it if you need to. Oh, no, it's just stuck. It's okay. That's okay. I'll go ahead and read the scripture while it's trying to go. The centurion comes up to him to make sure he's dead. Sorry.
Which one am I going to?
The last one. John chapter 19, verse 30 and 32. 32 through 34, I'm sorry. It says, Then came the soldiers and brake the legs of the first and other which was crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw he was dead already, they broke not his legs. But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came there out blood and water. Two things I want to point out here. When the centurion came to make sure he was dead, he would have stabbed up into the fifth intercostal space. Anybody that's a nurse or medical field or anything, the fifth intercostal space is still the space that we use to put in chest tubes and stuff. If someone has a collapsed lung or something like that, that's still the same space. They knew this in the first century. We still use it today, 2,000 years later. They were really smart and really good at what they did. So he would have stabbed the spear up through the fifth intercostal space. The reason he does this is because it would have pierced all the way through into the front of the lung and into the heart. So this is like if you're looking at a camera down through this way. So this is the front, this is your sternum, your rib cage. So he stabs here into the front, and he would have pierced the heart itself. And it says blood and water flowed. So what little bit of blood was still circulating through his heart would have come out. The water is that pleural sac that I was talking about. The sac, the pericardium around the heart would have been ruptured by the spear, and the water that was around the sac would have flowed out with it. Some people want to say that they pierced him through the bladder. Guys, your bladder is way down here. That's not it. This was the pleural sac. I mean the epicardial sac, where the cardiac sac would have been ruptured, and that's where the blood and the water came from. The blood was from the heart itself, and the water was the sac around it. But guys, I want to point out here the reason why it's so important that the Bible talks about the fact that they didn't break his legs. So many times, I told you that if a person wasn't scourged, wasn't beaten, and didn't lose a lot of blood, they could last on the cross for days. The reason why they broke the other two hanging with him, the reason why they broke their legs, is so that they could no longer push themselves up. They would have died very quickly from suffocation because they wouldn't have been able to pull themselves up anymore. They didn't want this to take days, and days. Especially, like I said, this is a Passover week. So they're wanting to get this taken care of so that nobody, accuses them of messing up their ceremonies. But they said that they saw that Jesus was already dead. The Lamb of the Passover, going all the way back to Exodus. Exodus chapter 12, verse 46. Says, Neither shall ye break a bone thereof. Talking about the Passover lamb that was slain to be eaten with the Passover. There was, you weren't to break any of their bones. Jesus Christ is our Passover lamb. We went to Matthew's concert last night, and they gave a message. A guy from Baldwin preached on the Passover. And I thought it was really cool that he brought all that out. And the fact that when Jesus gives the Lord's Supper there with the disciples at Passover, it doesn't mention anything about there being a lamb on the table. Because Jesus was the lamb. There was the bread and there was the wine, but there was no lamb because Jesus was it. And so here, it's very important that the Scripture bears everything out. Psalm chapter 34, verse 20, again, speaking of the righteous one, says, He keepeth all his bones, and not one shall be broken. Everything ties together throughout the entire Bible. I tried not to make this very graphic tonight. There are a ton of other slides I could have used that just showed blood and all this kind of stuff. It's not about that. What I wanted to show you was the physical side of everything that Jesus went through. But I say it over and over and over. The physical side was nothing compared to the spiritual and the emotional abuse that Jesus took on the cross. And he took all of that for us. There's a song that says he could have called 10,000 angels. He didn't have to suffer this. He could have called himself down at any time. He could have wiped out everyone around him with a thought. But because he was 100% God, as well as 100% man, he was completely in control of everything about himself. His emotions never got the best of him. Can you imagine that kind of pressure? To know that as God, he could have thought anything. He could have said anything, and it would have been instantaneous. Even during all of this, he never lost control. He never stopped thinking about why he was doing what he was doing. And he was doing it for me. He was doing it for you. Does anybody have any questions or anything? We're never going to be able to understand the extent of everything Jesus suffered. Because no one in history has ever suffered the way he did. Yes, there were thousands upon thousands of crucifixions. And the crucifixion itself went just like any other crucifixion. Physically. But the fact that the sun was blackened during the crucifixion, the veil was torn, earthquakes, dead people rose up out of the grave, the centurion looks, the very one who stabs the spear, and knows that he's dead. And guys, that's what gets me a lot of times, is because so many people want to say, well, he really wasn't dead. This was all just a conspiracy. He was just near death. Guys, the Romans knew what they were doing. And it says, when they came to him and saw he was already dead, they didn't break his legs. They just stabbed a spear straight through his heart. So guess what? If he wasn't dead before, he's dead now. Jesus Christ died on a cross for me and for you. And then he rose 3 days later in all of his glory. Sunday morning, like I said, it's going to be a little different Easter message. We're going to be past the cross. We're going to be ready for Jesus to ascend back into glory, and it's going to be us figuring out what we're supposed to do next. Anybody have anything? Go ahead and stop the video.